They first heard it in the dark, the strange, rapid cracking of a rifle that did not sound like anything the Imperial Japanese Army had trained for. On the night of August 21, 1942, during the Battle of the Tenaru on Guadalcanal, Japanese infantry emerging from the jungle expected the familiar rhythm of American bolt-action fire, slow, deliberate, one shot at a time. Instead, they heard continuous fire, 8-round bursts delivered so quickly it sounded like a machine gun fed by some new American trick. As they rushed forward under the moonlight, weaving between palm trees and sandbars, they saw the flashes, closely spaced, unnervingly regular, and for the first time realized that the Americans carried a rifle that could fire as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. The M1 Garand, the first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle fielded by any major army, was about to overturn everything the Japanese infantry had believed about close combat. To the U.S. Marines holding the sandbar that night, the rifle felt almost alive in their hands. They no longer had to lift, pull, and slam a bolt forward after every shot like they had with the old M1903 Springfield. Instead, they simply aimed, squeezed, reacquired the target, and squeezed again, 8 times in the space it took a Japanese rifleman to fire 1 or 2 well-aimed rounds. In a jungle fight where seconds meant survival, the Garand wasn't just a weapon, it was a revolution measured in heartbeats. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized aggression, speed, and shock. The Arisaka Type 99 bolt-action rifle had served them well in China, where engagements often took place at medium range, and Japanese soldiers enjoyed the advantage of training, discipline, and ferocity. Against Chinese nationalist troops, armed mostly with older rifles, the Arisaka's slow rate of fire mattered far less. But Guadalcanal was not China. The Americans fought differently. They dug in, stayed low, used cover, and employed fire discipline that turned their defensive lines into walls of steel. When the Japanese launched their first major assaults against Marine positions, they were stunned to find that the Americans could produce rifle fire 3, 4, even 5 times faster than anything they considered possible from standard infantrymen. That night on the Tenaru, Japanese soldiers expecting gaps in American fire, moments when the riflemen paused to operate their bolts, found no gaps at all. The sound was unbroken. Lance Corporal Mitchell Page of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, later recalled how the M1 allowed his men to cut down anything that moved toward the river. Japanese after-action reports recovered months later described the American rifle as a weapon that does not stop firing, unable to comprehend that a single Marine could fire so rapidly and so accurately without assistance. To the Japanese soldiers charging forward with bayonets fixed, the shock was immediate and devastating. Their doctrine depended on reaching close range quickly, overwhelming American lines before sustained fire could break their momentum. But the Garand denied them that hope. Every second of their advance brought another volley, steady, punishing, merciless. Officers tried to urge their men on, shouting into the darkness, but those commands were drowned beneath the rising roar of semi-automatic fire. In the chaos of the assault, some Japanese troops mistook the M1 for a new kind of light machine gun, believing the Americans had somehow equipped entire platoons with automatic weapons. What they were really facing was simply a rifle a generation ahead of its time. By dawn, the sandbar was littered with bodies. Captain Tsuji's battalion, which had expected to sweep away a small American beachhead, had been annihilated. And among the few survivors who escaped back into the jungle, rumors spread quickly. The Americans had a rifle that fired faster than any bolt-action weapon in the world. Those rumors reached Rabaul, then Japan, then the intelligence sections of multiple divisions. The Japanese army, which had once scoffed at Western attempts to arm entire infantry forces with semi-automatic rifles, now faced the unbearable truth that John Garand's invention had given every American rifleman the firepower of 2 or 3 men. The power of the M1 was not merely its rate of fire, but how seamlessly it integrated into the way Americans fought. The U.S. emphasized individual marksmanship. Marines and soldiers trained to fire quickly and accurately at moving targets. Combined with the Garand's gas-operated system, aperture sights, and reliable 8-round en bloc clip, This training turned each infantryman into a threat at close and medium range. Japanese officers noted bitterly that the Americans could maintain suppressive fire without relying solely on machine guns, making Japanese tactical approaches, flanking rushes, infiltration teams, nighttime assaults, far more difficult to execute. On Guadalcanal, the jungle amplified this advantage. Visibility was short, ambush distance even shorter. The moment a Japanese patrol entered an American kill zone, the Garands opened up, controlled, tight volleys that left no window for the enemy to react. Sergeant John Basilone, who would later win the Medal of Honor on the island, described how Garands made his machine gun teams exponentially deadlier, filling the gaps whenever a gun overheated or a barrel needed changing. The rifles never stopped, he said, and that's what kept them back. By the time the battle for Henderson Field reached its peak in October 1942, Japanese commanders understood that they were facing something fundamentally new. They tried to adapt, ordering their troops to crawl, disperse, or delay firing until the last moment, but nothing restored the initiative they had once enjoyed. Every attack ended the same way, shattered by the sound of semi-automatic fire ripping through the jungle. The M1 Garand had arrived in the Pacific not as a piece of equipment, but as a shockwave, and the Japanese infantry, who had dominated Asian battlefields for a decade, now found themselves staring at a weapon that erased their tactical assumptions in a single night. They had always believed that bravery and aggression could overcome superior equipment. On Guadalcanal, they learned the hard way that courage meant little when the enemy fired twice as fast, twice as accurately, and never seemed to pause for breath. Long before Japanese infantrymen understood the full implications of America's semi-automatic rifle, their own weapons had already doomed them to a disadvantage they could not overcome. The Arisaka Type 99, introduced as Japan's primary service rifle in 1939, was a rugged and reliable bolt-action design, accurate and durable, capable of surviving mud, rain, salt air, and jungle rot. But no matter how strong a bolt-action rifle was, it still required a soldier to break his firing stance after every shot, lift his hand from the trigger, cycle the bolt, reacquire his target, and fire again. In training fields in Hokkaido or Manchuria, this limitation did not matter. In China, where many engagements took place at long distance, Japanese marksmanship and discipline made the Arisaka a deadly tool. But on Pacific Islands, dense, wet, claustrophobic battlefields that forced engagements into 30 to 50 yards, the mechanical limits of the bolt-action rifle became fatal. The M1 Garand's design solved every problem the Arisaka could not. Its gas-operated semi-automatic system turned each American infantryman into a continuous source of firepower. Where a Japanese rifleman might fire one shot, work the bolt, fire another, and hope he was not already under suppressive fire, a U.S. Marine with the Garand could deliver shot after shot with no interruption. Tests conducted by the U.S. Army before the war demonstrated that the average rifleman could fire 40 to 50 accurate rounds per minute with the M1, roughly triple the practical rate of fire of the Arisaka in combat conditions. That number shocked Japanese observers after the war, but during the fighting itself, Japanese infantry experienced the difference not as a statistic, but as a sudden and overwhelming wall of lead whenever they tried to close the distance. The sights alone revealed the technological gap. The Garand's aperture sight provided a wide field of view, exceptional clarity, and quick target acquisition. The Arisaka's open leaf sight, while acceptable for long-range marksmanship, was slower and more difficult to use under pressure. In the thick jungles of Guadalcanal, New Georgia, or Bougainville, where shadows moved unpredictably and enemies appeared and vanished in seconds, the Garand's superior sights gave American riflemen crucial fractions of a second, fractions that often meant life or death. But the true terror for Japanese infantry was not the rate of fire or the superior sights alone. It was how effortlessly Americans could maintain that rate of fire under stress. The M1's 8-round en-bloc clip allowed for rapid reloading even in total darkness. A Marine could slap in a fresh clip by feel alone, close the bolt, and resume firing in less than 2 seconds. Japanese infantrymen, by contrast, had to load 5-round stripper clips into the Arisaka's internal magazine, an action harder to perform while lying prone, when hands were muddy, or when the rifle was coated in sand. Even when the Arisaka was fully loaded, the soldier still had to operate the bolt for every shot, meaning he lost sight picture and firing rhythm continuously. In close-quarter fighting, like the brutal battles inside coconut groves on Guadalcanal, coral outcroppings on Tarawa, or cave complexes on Saipan, the Garand's dominance became overwhelming. Japanese tactics depended heavily on closing the gap quickly, using stealth, sudden charges, and infiltration to get inside American lines. The Arisaka was never designed to win prolonged firefights against superior firepower. It was designed to support a doctrine built around aggression and shock. But shock tactics collapse when the defender can fire 3 times faster than the attacker. Reports across the Pacific repeated the same pattern. Japanese units attempted nighttime infiltration, hit the outskirts of American positions, and were met with bursts of accurate semi-automatic fire that shredded the attack before it reached bayonet range. One Japanese officer captured on Saipan described the experience bluntly. "Your rifles fire like machine guns. Ours fire like nothing." Even when Japanese troops managed to fire the first volley, American return fire followed so quickly that Japanese squads often broke before they could reload. A U.S. Army unit on New Georgia reported repelling 5 successive attacks in a single night with minimal casualties, crediting their survival entirely to the Garand. The after-action report stated, "The ability of each rifleman to continue firing without pause was decisive. Enemy troops did not understand why our fire never slowed." The Garand also proved more durable than Japanese soldiers expected. Many assumed a semi-automatic rifle would jam in the jungle's humidity, or misfire in sand, or rust in salt air. But the M1, thanks to its stainless steel gas cylinder, rugged operating rod, and chrome-lined barrel in later variations, kept functioning even after days without cleaning. Japanese troops reported searching dead Americans for signs of jams or malfunctions, only to find rifles that had fired every round without a single stoppage. Conversely, the Arisaka, though mechanically reliable, could not overcome its fundamental limitation. It was simply too slow. In an age when combat was becoming faster, closer, and more chaotic, the Japanese infantrymen carried a rifle designed for the battles of the previous century. The Americans carried one designed for the war they were actually fighting. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence sections formally acknowledged that the M1 Garand was technically superior to the Type 99 in all categories except bayonet fighting. But even that small comfort proved hollow. Americans rarely allowed Japanese forces to close the distance for bayonet combat because the Garand's continuous fire kept them at range. The result was a battlefield transformation the Japanese could not stop or duplicate. Their industrial base lacked the capacity to mass-produce a semi-automatic rifle. Their army lacked the time to retrain troops in new firing doctrines, and their infantry, once the most feared in Asia, now found themselves outgunned in the most literal sense. In every jungle skirmish, every night attack, every desperate defense of a ridge or cave, the equation was the same. A Japanese rifleman could fire 1 shot. A Garand rifleman could fire 3. And when the fighting closed to 50 yards, that difference decided everything.
The real proving ground for the M1 Garand was not on a rifle range or in controlled patrol skirmishes. It was in the nightmare chaos of Japanese night attacks, where entire companies hurled themselves forward in screaming waves designed to overwhelm American lines before they could bring their firepower to bear. These attacks had worked across Asia from 1937 to 1941. They broke Chinese defenses, terrified poorly trained colonial units, and shattered positions that relied on slow-firing rifles and hesitant machine gun crews. But on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, New Georgia, and Saipan, the Japanese infantry encountered something they had never faced before: A line of riflemen who could produce near-continuous fire without breaking rhythm, without losing sight picture, without ever stopping to manipulate a bolt. The moment a Banzai charge crossed into effective range, the Garand turned every American foxhole into the equivalent of a miniature machine gun nest. The psychology of a Banzai attack depended on momentum. Japanese soldiers were trained to believe that if they charged quickly enough, screening, firing from the hip, throwing grenades, they could break the enemy's will to resist before he could organize his defense. Against Soviet forces at Khalkhin Gol or British troops in Malaya, this tactic sometimes worked. But it depended on one crucial assumption, that defenders would hesitate, fumble, or be too slow to fire enough rounds to stop the onrushing wave. The M1 Garand shattered that assumption instantly. On Guadalcanal, after the first failed assaults along the Ilu River, Japanese commanders believed the Americans had used hidden machine guns to create the storm of fire that broke the attack. They could not accept that ordinary riflemen produced such volume. When they launched a second major offensive in September, this time under General Kawaguchi, they again expected gaps in American fire during reloads. But the Garands never slowed. Marines fired until barrels glowed, until their en-bloc clips pinged onto the jungle floor, and then instantly fed new clips into their rifles and resumed shooting. Kawaguchi's assault, intended to sweep across ridge positions held by fewer than 2 battalions, disintegrated into carnage. Survivors described the fire as continuous lightning. By 1943, Japanese commanders had adjusted their Banzai doctrine for New Georgia and Bougainville, incorporating more infiltration and staggered thrusts, believing this would disrupt American fire patterns. But American units were now fully comfortable with the Garand. They trained to fire in overlapping zones, to maintain interlocking fields of semi-automatic fire even in low visibility, and to use the rifle's speed to break up assaults before they reached grenade range. In one nighttime attack near Munda, an entire Japanese company charged a U.S. defensive perimeter. The Americans responded with a wall of Garand fire so dense and sustained that few attackers crossed the 30-yard line. A post-battle report noted, "The semi-automatic rifle prevented the enemy from closing. Had we possessed bolt actions, the result might have been different." Nowhere was this dynamic more dramatically displayed than on Tarawa in November 1943. During the brutal fighting on Batio Island, Japanese defenders, elite Special Naval Landing Forces, launched counterattacks intended to push Marines back into the surf. But the Garand's rate of fire turned every attempt into disaster. Even when Japanese troops emerged from bunkers within 50 yards of American positions, the Marines' rapid volleys tore them apart before they could charge effectively. Tarawa was a battle measured in hours, but in those hours the superiority of semi-automatic fire saved countless Marines. And yet, Tarawa was only a prelude to the larger and more brutal shock awaiting the Japanese army on Saipan. The island saw one of the largest Banzai charges of the entire Pacific War, an assault involving more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers, including walking wounded and rear area personnel. It came on the night of July 7, 1944, when the Japanese, out of food and ammunition, launched a final charge against the American 27th Infantry Division. They expected chaos, terror, and hesitation. Instead, they ran into hundreds of U.S. riflemen armed with M1 Garands. As the massive wave advanced, American lines lit up with relentless semi-automatic fire. Riflemen fired so quickly and consistently that officers reported hearing no pauses anywhere along the line. The Garand's recoil system allowed rapid reacquisition of targets, and the aperture sights let American soldiers pick out advancing silhouettes even in near darkness. When the first layer of attackers fell, the second wave stumbled over them, then the third. Still, the Garands continued. Bar gunners laid down supporting fire, machine guns roared, but the backbone of the American defense, the sheer volume of rifle fire, never faltered. By 1943, Japanese commanders had adjusted their Banzai doctrine for New Georgia and Bougainville, incorporating more infiltration and staggered thrusts, believing this would disrupt American fire patterns. But American units were now fully comfortable with the Garand. They trained to fire in overlapping zones, to maintain interlocking fields of semi-automatic fire even in low visibility, and to use the rifle's speed to break up assaults before they reached grenade range. In one nighttime attack near Munda, an entire Japanese company charged a U.S. defensive perimeter. The Americans responded with a wall of Garand fire so dense and sustained that few attackers crossed the 30-yard line. A post-battle report noted the semi-automatic rifle prevented the enemy from closing. Had we possessed bolt actions, the result might have been different. Nowhere was this dynamic more dramatically displayed than on Tarawa in November 1943. During the brutal fighting on Batio Island, Japanese defenders, elite Special Naval Landing Forces, launched counterattacks intended to push Marines back into the surf. But the Garand's rate of fire turned every attempt into disaster. Even when Japanese troops emerged from bunkers within 50 yards of American positions, the Marines' rapid volleys tore them apart before they could charge effectively. Tarawa was a battle measured in hours, but in those hours the superiority of semi-automatic fire saved countless Marines. And yet, Tarawa was only a prelude to the larger and more brutal shock awaiting the Japanese army on Saipan. The island saw one of the largest Banzai charges of the entire Pacific War, an assault involving more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers, including walking wounded and rear area personnel. It came on the night of July 7, 1944, when the Japanese, out of food and ammunition, launched a final charge against the American 27th Infantry Division. They expected chaos, terror, and hesitation. Instead, they ran into hundreds of U.S. riflemen armed with M1 Garands. As the massive wave advanced, American lines lit up with relentless semi-automatic fire. Riflemen fired so quickly and consistently that officers reported hearing no pauses anywhere along the line. The Garand's recoil system allowed rapid reacquisition of targets, and the aperture sights let American soldiers pick out advancing silhouettes even in near darkness. When the first layer of attackers fell, the second wave stumbled over them, then the third. Still, the Garands continued. Bar gunners laid down supporting fire, machine guns roared, but the backbone of the American defense, the sheer volume of rifle fire, never faltered. By 1944, Japanese infantry faced an unavoidable truth. The Americans had brought a weapon to the battlefield that negated the most iconic element of Japanese offensive doctrine. And every island that fell, from Guadalcanal to Saipan, proved the same conclusion. The era of bolt-action dominance was over. The M1 Garand had ended it.
Long before the war in the Pacific reached its climax, Japanese infantrymen had begun whispering about a weapon they could not match. It was not the flamethrower, nor the Thompson, nor even the BAR. It was the rifle. The one American weapon every Japanese soldier encountered firsthand, usually in the last seconds before he fell. The M1 Garand, with its fast, steady cadence and uncanny reliability, became something more than a technical advantage. It became a psychological weapon, a sound that spread dread through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army. Reports from Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Bougainville, Tarawa, and Saipan all repeated the same phrase: the American rifle that never stops. This fear did not emerge from rumor alone. It emerged from what Japanese soldiers experienced in the field. In China, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia, Japanese troops had fought armies armed with bolt-action rifles similar to their own. The tempo of battle felt familiar. The rhythm of fire, the cracks broken by the metallic click of bolts cycling, gave attackers predictable windows to maneuver. When facing British or Dutch forces, Japanese infantry could sometimes rush forward between volleys, advancing during the natural pauses of manual reloading. On the Asian continent, this rhythm had helped fuel the myth of Japanese invincibility. But in the Pacific, when Japanese soldiers faced the Americans, the rhythm was gone. The pauses were gone. The windows were gone.
The Garand replaced the stop-start pattern of bolt-action combat with a relentless rolling fire that denied attackers any chance to regain momentum. Even elite Japanese formations, veterans of Shanghai, Nanking, Malaya, found themselves stunned by how little time they had to execute maneuver under American fire. A soldier who could usually sprint 10 or 15 yards between enemy shots now found himself pinned instantly. The battlefield had changed, and Japanese infantry understood it viscerally. Captured diaries from Guadalcanal reveal the earliest reactions. One infantryman wrote, "Their rifles fire like storm wind. We cannot lift our heads." Another, "We thought they used many light machine guns, but the rifles, those rifles never slow." Japanese officers tried to reassure their men that American firepower depended on machine guns, not individual riflemen. But the men at the front knew better. They could see the flashes. They could hear the mixed cadence of BARs and Garands and understood that unlike the Arisaka, the American rifle required no pause. By 1943, Japanese intelligence branches had begun studying the M1 Garand more formally. Weapons captured on Guadalcanal were shipped to Rabaul and then to Japan, where ordnance engineers tested them and issued bleak assessments. One internal report warned, "The enemy's infantryman fires many shots with great speed. Our soldiers must be cautious when engaging at medium range, as he may fire before we can reload." The most troubling discovery was the Garand's mechanical reliability. Engineers exposed it to humidity, mud, and salt conditions that often crippled semi-automatic designs. To their frustration, the rifle kept functioning. What unsettled Japanese commanders most was that the M1 Garand and the American system that supported it neutralized their most sacred battlefield principle, the primacy of offensive spirit. For decades, Japanese doctrine taught that courage and willpower could overcome technological disadvantages. The Japanese soldier was trained to believe that superior morale, speed, and aggression would break the defenses of any Western army. But morale could not change the fact that an Arisaka rifleman required about half a second to operate his bolt and reacquire a target, half a second in which a Marine could fire 2 aimed shots. Willpower could not create openings in a curtain of semi-automatic fire that never stopped. This realization was particularly devastating among officers. Their status, and often their survival, depended on leading from the front. Yet officers equipped with swords or pistols, symbols of the traditional leader, now found themselves exposed in the deadly first seconds of any assault. On Saipan, analysts discovered that many Japanese officers were killed before they had even closed half the distance to American lines. Not because their men faltered, but because the Garand allowed U.S. riflemen to pick out leaders and eliminate them instantly. Removing officers early in the charge caused Japanese formations to lose cohesion far sooner than expected, creating confusion and panic, even among highly trained units. The psychological strain intensified as the war progressed. Japanese soldiers arriving on islands like Peleliu and Leyte came with months of rumors swirling through their ranks. That the Americans had a rifle that fired without end, that U.S. infantrymen could lay down fire like machine gunners, that even wounded Americans could turn and fire 3 shots before a Japanese rifleman operated his bolt once. These rumors created a kind of anticipatory fear, an emotional defeat before the physical battle had even begun. Testimonies from Japanese POWs after the war confirmed this. Many admitted they had considered American infantry overwhelmingly powerful, not because of numbers or bravery, but because of the rifle in their hands. At the strategic level, Japanese commanders faced a problem they could not solve. They lacked the industrial capacity to field the comparable semi-automatic rifle. Wartime shortages of steel, machining tools, and mass production facilities made it impossible to arm millions of soldiers with anything more advanced than the Arisaka. Even attempts to prototype semi-automatic rifles stalled. Japan simply could not afford the luxury of adopting a new standard weapon in the middle of a losing war. Thus, Japanese infantry went into battle again and again with rifles that belonged to an earlier era. and each time they encountered Americans whose standard weapon had already leapt a generation ahead. The cumulative effect was devastating not only to battlefield outcomes, but to Japanese morale. A tool meant to strengthen Japanese faith in their own aggression, the Arisaka, had become a symbol of their inferiority in the new reality of modern firepower. By 1944, Japanese commanders no longer underestimated the Garand. They feared it. They wrote about it in pre-battle briefings. They warned their troops that American rifle fire would be fast, constant, and deadly at every range. Yet no warning could prepare infantrymen for the shock of hearing that unmistakable cadence, the crisp, rhythmic snapping that told them they only had seconds left before the line ahead collapsed under its own casualties. The Garand had become more than a weapon. It had become the sound of American dominance in the Pacific, and for those who faced it, it was the sound of a war slipping beyond Japan's control. By the time American forces reached the Marianas in mid-1944, the M1 Garand was no longer simply a battlefield advantage. It had become the backbone of an infantry system that Japan could neither match nor disrupt. In a theater where every yard of ground was fought for in suffocating jungles, volcanic ridges, and labyrinths of caves, the Garand did more than fire bullets. It reshaped American tactics, amplified unit cohesion, and turned every rifle squad into a mobile source of overwhelming firepower. It changed how Americans advanced, how they held ground, and how they coordinated with artillery, armor, and naval gunfire. In short, it helped define the tempo of the Pacific War, one Japan could not keep up with. To understand how decisively the Garand shaped that tempo, one must look at how the U.S. infantry platoon functioned. Before World War II, rifle squads across most armies still fought around machine guns, with riflemen serving largely as support. But by equipping every American soldier with a semi-automatic rifle, the U.S. effectively multiplied the firepower of each platoon. A 13-man U.S. squad could now sustain the equivalent output of a small machine gun section from previous wars. This meant Americans could suppress enemy positions without waiting for Browning automatic rifles or heavy machine guns to be brought into play. They could win firefights on their own initiative, not only through supporting arms, but through the direct, constant pressure of individual riflemen. This mattered immensely in the Pacific. On islands like Saipan and Peleliu, where Japanese defenders occupied caves, bunkers, trenches, and labyrinths of caves, the Garand did more than fire bullets. It reshaped Japanese tactics, amplified unit cohesion, and turned every rifle squad into a mobile source of overwhelming firepower. It changed how Americans advanced, how they held ground, and how they coordinated with artillery, armor, and naval gunfire. In short, it helped define the tempo of the Pacific War, one Japan could not keep up with. To understand how decisively the Garand shaped that tempo, one must look at how the U.S. infantry platoon functioned. Before World War II, rifle squads across most armies still fought around machine guns, with riflemen serving largely as support. But by equipping every American soldier with a semi-automatic rifle, the U.S. effectively multiplied the firepower of each platoon. A 13-man U.S. squad could now sustain the equivalent output of a small machine gun section from previous wars. This meant Americans could suppress enemy positions without waiting for Browning automatic rifles or heavy machine guns to be brought into play. They could win firefights on their own initiative, not only through supporting arms, but through the direct, constant pressure of individual riflemen. This mattered immensely in the Pacific. On islands like Saipan and Peleliu, where Japanese defenders occupied caves, bunkers, trenches, and labyrinths of caves, the Garand did more than fire bullets. This mattered immensely in the Pacific. On islands like Saipan and Peleliu, where Japanese defenders occupied caves, bunkers, trenches, and labyrinths of caves, the key to survival was rapid reaction. Japanese counterattacks often came with little warning. Garand-equipped units could respond immediately, hitting attackers with accurate fire before they closed the distance. Japanese commanders soon recognized that American infantry rarely faltered under sudden pressure because the rifle each man carried already provided the stability and firepower to meet any small-scale threat. The Garand also improved coordination between infantry and supporting arms. Because riflemen could maintain covering fire on their own, forward observers had more time to call artillery missions. Engineers could approach obstacles with greater confidence. Tanks could advance, knowing the infantry beside them could suppress anti-tank teams without delay. This synergy became especially visible during the grueling campaign for Okinawa, where Garand-armed infantry worked seamlessly with armor to root out stubborn Japanese positions. Every time a cave opened fire, riflemen pinned down defenders while flamethrowers and demolitions teams advanced. The split-second response time, made possible by semi-automatic fire, helped prevent Japanese gunners from relocating or mounting secondary attacks. Japan, meanwhile, experienced the reverse effect. Because their infantry depended on bolt-action rifles, Japanese squads lacked the sustained firepower needed to hold off American advances. They compensated with elaborate defensive networks, tunnels, interlocking fields of fire, and layered cave systems. But these static defenses required infantry to delay the enemy long enough for the defense to activate. The Garand robbed them of that window. American units broke into positions faster, suppressed counterattacks faster, and exploited openings faster. Even the bravery of Japanese soldiers, which had shocked poorly prepared troops in Malaya and the Philippines, faltered when met by relentless volleys. This widening firepower gap shaped Japanese tactical evolution. Unable to win firefights, they shifted toward ambushes, night attacks, and infiltration. But here, too, the Garand gave Americans the edge. During infiltration attempts, Japanese soldiers depended on stealth and timing. But once discovered, they needed to close the distance before defenders could fire multiple rounds. That distance closed far too slowly against a rifle that responded instantly. In many reports, American positions repelled infiltration attempts not with machine guns, but with Garands firing in coordinated bursts, a kind of distributed automatic fire the Japanese could not adapt to. Technology, doctrine, and manpower all intersected here. The U.S. industrial system produced millions of Garands, ensuring every frontline soldier carried the same tool. Ammunition was plentiful, replacement parts flowed freely. Training emphasized rapid target acquisition and trigger discipline. The entire American war machine, from factory workers in Massachusetts to Marines landing on volcanic beaches, worked in unison to maximize the rifle's potential. Japan had no such system. Their industrial capacity was stretched thin by 1942. Their steel production plummeted under Allied bombing. Their training pipelines shortened drastically as the war dragged on. The Type 99 rifle, once a symbol of Japanese pride, became an anchor tied to an army fighting a war it had not prepared for. Even attempts to increase firepower, such as issuing more light machine guns, failed to compensate for the fundamental problem. The average Japanese infantryman simply could not compete with the American riflemen on even terms. Perhaps the most revealing evidence came from Japanese officers interviewed after the war. When asked which American weapon they feared most, many did not cite the flamethrower, the bazooka, or naval gunfire. They chose the M1 Garand. Not because it was the deadliest individual weapon, but because it represented a shift in battlefield reality that Japan could not reverse. It ensured that in every engagement, from the first skirmish in jungle shadows to the final desperate defense in a shattered cave, the Americans dictated the pace, distance, and lethality of combat. By 1945, as U.S. forces approached the Japanese home islands, the Garand had become inseparable from the American way of war. It empowered fire teams, stabilized defensive lines, and underpinned the astonishing momentum of island-hopping campaigns. Japan's infantry, outmatched technologically and overwhelmed logistically, could no longer dictate the nature of the fight. The rifle that never stopped firing had taken that role away. The Garand did not win the Pacific War by itself, but it ensured that wherever American infantry went, from the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal to the beaches of Saipan to the ridges of Okinawa, They carried with them a decisive, relentless advantage. And for the Japanese soldiers who faced it, the M1 Garand became a sound they associated with a war slipping irrevocably out of their grasp. A steady, unbroken rhythm that announced an enemy they could not outrun, outmaneuver, or outshoot.